I was gone for 6 days. Not 6 months, not 6 years, 6 days. And somehow that was enough time for my homeowners association to decide that a piece of my family's land no longer belonged to my family. The first thing I saw when I pulled my truck into the driveway wasn't the new fence. It wasn't the landscaping either. It was a woman walking her golden retriever across a paved trail that absolutely did not exist when I left. I remember sitting there with the engine still running, staring through the windshield, trying to convince myself I was looking at the wrong property. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I took a wrong turn after the airport. But then I saw the old cottonwood tree near the western boundary and my stomach dropped. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The problem was that somebody had changed what was there. My name is Ethan Holloway, and my family has owned that strip of land outside Brookridge, Colorado, for longer than most of the houses around it have existed. My grandfather bought the acreage back when the area was mostly pasture and dirt roads. Back then, nobody cared about walking paths, community gardens, or beautification committees. People respected fences because fences usually meant somebody would come outside and ask what the hell you were doing on their property. These days, things work differently. At least that's what I learned. I climbed out of my truck and started walking toward the trail. Fresh concrete, brand new fencing, decorative shrubs, little signs stuck into the ground every 20 feet welcoming residents to what they called the Brookridge Community Greenway. Community Greenway. I actually laughed when I read that sign because the sign was sitting about 3 feet inside my property line. It wasn't nervous laughter either. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when your brain hasn't fully caught up to reality yet. I walked farther down the trail, and the more I looked, the worse it got. The old iron survey marker near the drainage ditch was gone. The wooden stakes I maintained for years had disappeared. Even the dirt path I used to drive my utility vehicle down had been buried beneath concrete. It was like somebody had opened a history book about my land and ripped out every page they didn't like. A few residents walked by while I was standing there. Most smiled politely. One guy nodded and said, "Looks great, doesn't it?" I just looked at him. He had no idea who I was. To him, I was another neighbor admiring the improvement. I said, "Depends on who owns it." He laughed and kept walking. I don't think he understood what I meant. By the time I got back to the house, I was angry, but not the kind of angry that makes you yell. My father used to say that loud anger is expensive. Quiet anger makes money. So instead of marching into the HOA office, I sat at my kitchen table, pulled out a folder, and started reviewing every survey, deed, and property record I had. 3 generations of paperwork sat in front of me. Everything matched what I already knew. The land was mine, not partially mine, not disputed, not unclear. Mine. The next morning, I called the HOA office. A woman named Melissa answered. Her voice sounded cheerful enough to sell holiday decorations. I explained who I was and asked why there was a walking trail on my property. There was a brief pause before she responded, almost like she had rehearsed the answer beforehand. "Mr. Holloway, that area was incorporated into our community enhancement project approved by the board several months ago." I said, "You incorporated my land?" Another pause. "Well, the area was considered underutilized open space that could better serve the neighborhood." Underutilized. That's the word she used. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. It amazed me how often people invent new phrases when they're trying to avoid saying they took something that didn't belong to them. I asked if anyone had contacted me. She said they believed the property boundaries were unclear. I asked if anyone checked the county records. She said she wasn't sure. I asked if anyone requested permission. The question got the longest silence of all. Eventually, she said, "I can arrange a meeting with the board." I told her not to bother. Then I hung up. That afternoon, I called someone else. A surveyor named Grant Whitaker. Grant was one of those old-school professionals who still carried paper maps folded inside a weathered leather tube. He'd surveyed ranches, farms, and mountain properties for almost 40 years. More importantly, he hated assumptions. When I explained the situation, he chuckled and said, "Well, that's either a misunderstanding or a lawsuit waiting to happen." 2 days later, he arrived with his equipment. We spent most of the morning walking the property. He barely spoke. He'd stop, take measurements, make notes, then move again. Every so often, he'd plant a bright orange flag in the ground. At first, the flags appeared near the edge of the trail. Then they started appearing directly in the middle of it. Then inside the landscape sections. Then beyond the fence itself. Around lunchtime, I noticed something. Grant wasn't finding occasional encroachments. He was tracing an entire stolen boundary. By late afternoon, the trail looked like it had developed a rash of orange warning flags. Residents passing by started slowing down. Some stopped to watch. One woman asked if construction was happening. Grant didn't answer. He just kept measuring. Finally, he folded his tripod, walked over to me, and handed me a preliminary map. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Ethan, they didn't build into your property." He pointed toward the trail. "They replaced it." And standing there under the afternoon sun, looking at a community project that never should have existed, I realized I was done asking people to fix their mistake. Because what happened next wasn't going to be about removal anymore. It was going to be about cost. Cost is a funny thing. Most people think of it as money, but that's not really what cost means. Cost is consequence. Cost is the moment somebody realizes their shortcut wasn't actually shorter. And over the next few weeks, I became very interested in making sure the Brookridge HOA understood exactly what their consequences looked like. The morning after Grant finished the survey, I drove into town and met with an attorney named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca had built a reputation handling property disputes, easement conflicts, and the kind of neighborhood arguments that usually start with somebody saying, "I thought it would be okay." I spread the survey maps across her conference table and watched her expression change as she followed the boundary lines. She didn't look shocked. Lawyers had edited, but she did raise one eyebrow, which I learned was basically the legal equivalent of somebody shouting. "They built all of this without permission?" she asked. Apparently, they thought the land was underutilized. Rebecca actually laughed. "That's not a legal category." By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. Most people expected me to demand immediate removal. That would have been the obvious move. It also would have been the fastest way to let the HOA frame the situation as a simple misunderstanding. I wasn't interested in misunderstandings anymore. I was interested in documented occupation of private property. So instead of sending a demolition demand, we sent something else. An invoice. Then another. Then another. The first notice informed the HOA that they were occupying privately owned land without authorization. Effective immediately, land use fees would be assessed. Daily occupation charges would accrue. Maintenance liabilities would be assigned. Unauthorized structural placement fees would apply. The language was professional, precise, and impossible to misunderstand. When the HOA received it, they treated it like a joke. I know because one of the board members accidentally told me so. 3 days later, I attended a public meeting. I wasn't even on the agenda. I simply sat in the back while they discussed landscaping budgets and pool maintenance. Eventually, the board president, a man named Leonard Pike, noticed me. Leonard was the kind of person who always sounded confident, even when he shouldn't. He smiled and said, "Mr. Holloway, I assume we're still working through that little property issue." Little property issue. I nodded. Absolutely. In fact, your next invoice should arrive tomorrow. A few people laughed. Leonard laughed too. He shouldn't have, because the invoices kept arriving. Every morning, another charge appeared. Every afternoon, another calculation was added. Usage fee, occupation fee, maintenance exposure, liability assessment. None of it happened randomly. Everything was supported by documentation and legal review. Within 10 days, the total amount exceeded what the HOA had spent building the trail in the first place. That's when the tone started changing. Suddenly, my phone calls got returned. Suddenly, emails arrived, marked urgent. Suddenly, people who previously believed the property line was unclear became very interested in reviewing county records. One evening, Leonard called me directly. "Ethan, let's be reasonable here." I remember smiling when he said that. Reasonable is another one of those words people discover right after their plan stops working. "I'm being reasonable," I replied. Reasonable would have been asking permission before construction. He sighed heavily. "The community uses that trail now. The community uses my land now." Silence. Then he said, "You're punishing residents who had nothing to do with this." I looked out my kitchen window toward the trail. A group of joggers passed by beneath one of the decorative HOA signs. No, I said, I'm billing the organization that put them there. After that conversation, I decided to make something very clear. Up until then, most residents didn't even know the trail crossed private property. They assumed the HOA owned everything they built on. So I installed a temporary gate at the original boundary line. Nothing aggressive, nothing dangerous, just a clearly visible gate and a professionally printed sign. Private property. Entry constitutes acceptance of land use fees. I expected people to stop. Some did. Many didn't. Human beings have a remarkable ability to ignore signs they don't like. For several days, residents simply walked around the gate or through the open access point beside it. A few took pictures and posted complaints online. Others insisted I was bluffing. Then the board received another invoice package. This one included estimated usage calculations based on observed foot traffic. That's when panic finally started spreading through the neighborhood. The community forum exploded. People argued for hours. Some residents blamed me. Others blamed the HOA. One comment became especially popular. Why didn't anybody verify ownership before spending association money? Nobody had a good answer. A retired engineer named Carl Jensen eventually attended a board meeting and publicly demanded an explanation. Carl wasn't known for being diplomatic. He stood up and said, "Are you telling us nobody checked who owned the land before building an entire trail?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. The following week, the HOA scheduled an emergency town hall. More than 100 residents showed up. The room felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Leonard stood at the front explaining how the situation was being evaluated. Every sentence sounded carefully crafted to avoid responsibility. Then somebody asked the question everyone wanted answered. Whose fault is this? The room went quiet. Leonard glanced toward me. I wasn't even speaking. I was sitting near the back, drinking coffee. Yet somehow everyone turned to look at me anyway. I remember thinking how strange that was. The only person in the room who hadn't made a mistake was somehow becoming the center of the controversy. After the meeting ended, several residents approached me. Some were angry. Some were curious. One older woman named Diane surprised me. She said, "I don't blame you." I asked why. She shrugged. Because if somebody built a walking trail through my living room, I probably wouldn't be very cooperative either. That made me laugh harder than anything else had in weeks. But while residents argued, lawyers got busy. The HOA hired outside counsel. They challenged the survey. We provided another survey. They requested documentation. We delivered decades of documentation. They questioned historical markers. We produced photographs, records, plats, and county filings. Every road led back to the same destination. The land belonged to me. The trail belonged on somebody else's property. By the third week, the financial impact had become impossible to ignore. The board started discussing reserve funds, budget adjustments, potential assessments. People who never cared about property law suddenly cared very much about accounting. That's when rumors started circulating that certain board members were blaming each other behind closed doors. Apparently, the beautification committee insisted the planning committee approve the boundary review. The planning committee claimed the legal committee had verified ownership. The legal committee claimed no verification request had ever been submitted. It was like watching a bucket of crabs pull itself apart. Then came the moment everything changed. One Friday afternoon, I received an email requesting a private meeting. No lawyers present. No public announcements. Just a conversation. We met at a small restaurant outside town. Leonard arrived with two board members I'd never spoken to before. The mood was completely different from our earlier interactions. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. They looked exhausted. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, one of them finally got to the point. We'd like to discuss purchasing the strip. There it was. The solution they should have pursued before construction began. They wanted to buy the land quietly, preserve the trail, and make the problem disappear. Leonard slid a folder across the table containing an offer. I didn't even open it. He looked surprised. "You don't want to see the number?" I leaned back and looked at him for a moment. "Leonard, if someone parks in your driveway without asking, you don't reward them by selling them your house. Nobody spoke. The waitress arrived and refilled our water glasses. The timing couldn't have been better. Finally, Leonard asked, "Then what do you want?" I looked out the restaurant window toward the mountains in the distance. For a second, I thought about my grandfather walking that property decades earlier. I thought about every assumption that had led us to this moment. Then I answered honestly. I want people to stop acting like ownership becomes optional when enough people decide they like what belongs to someone else. And that was the moment the meeting ended, even though nobody stood up for another 10 minutes. Because deep down they already knew where this was heading. They just hadn't accepted it yet. What they didn't realize was that the most expensive part of the entire ordeal still hadn't arrived. The most expensive part wasn't the invoices. It wasn't the attorneys. It wasn't even the possibility of a lawsuit. The most expensive part was pride. Pride has a way of convincing people to keep making bad decisions long after the smart option is sitting right in front of them. For another 2 weeks, the HOA tried to hold its position. Publicly, they insisted negotiations were ongoing. Privately, they were scrambling. Residents were demanding answers. Budget reports were being reviewed line by line. Committee members who had once proudly posed for photos beside the new trail suddenly wanted nothing to do with it. The entire project had become radioactive. One afternoon, I was repairing a fence on the far side of my property when I noticed 3 trucks pulling into the trail entrance. At first, I thought they were contractors doing maintenance. Then I saw what was loaded onto the trailers. Demolition equipment. I set my tools down and watched. A few minutes later, Leonard stepped out of one of the vehicles. We looked at each other from across the trail. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us waved. Finally, he walked over. "The board voted last night," he said. "We're removing everything." Just like that. No dramatic speech. No courtroom. No last-minute legal miracle. Just a simple sentence delivered by a very tired man. I nodded once. Probably the right decision. He looked around at the trail. "It's going to cost a fortune." I couldn't help myself. It already did. For the next several days, I watched the entire project disappear piece by piece. First came the signs. The same decorative signs that once welcomed residents to the Brookridge Community Greenway were pulled from the ground and stacked beside a dumpster. Then workers removed the fencing. Then the landscaping. Shrubs that had been planted with such confidence only weeks earlier were dug up and hauled away. Finally, they reached the concrete path itself. That part took longer. Jackhammers echoed across the neighborhood from sunrise until evening. Every crack running through that pavement felt symbolic somehow. Assumptions breaking apart one section at a time. Residents stopped to watch. Some looked frustrated. Some looked embarrassed. A few seemed relieved. One morning, Diane, the woman who compared the trail to somebody building through her living room, walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and stood beside me while workers tore out another section of concrete. After a few minutes, she said, "You know, half the neighborhood thinks you're a hero and the other half thinks you're a villain." I laughed. That usually means the truth is somewhere in the middle. She nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe people just don't like being reminded that actions have consequences. We stood there in silence for a while watching dust drift through the air. And honestly, I think she was closer to the truth than she realized. Because the entire situation had never really been about a walking trail. The trail was just the symptom. The real problem was entitlement. Somewhere along the way, a group of people convinced themselves that community benefit outweighed individual ownership. They decided that because they could improve something, they had the right to take control of it. That's a dangerous idea, no matter how good the intentions sound. By the end of the month, the property looked almost exactly the way it had before I left for my trip. New survey markers have been installed. The original boundary was restored. The last construction vehicle rolled away late on a Friday afternoon. As the dust settled, I walked the entire length of the strip alone. No concrete. No signs, no fencing, just my land again, the way it should have been from the beginning. I stopped near the old cottonwood tree and looked toward the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, everything was quiet. And that's when I realized something unexpected. I wasn't happy because I won. I was happy because the argument was over. Winning is overrated. Peace is better. A few days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA. It wasn't exactly an apology. Lawyers have a unique talent for writing entire pages without admitting fault. But buried inside all that carefully crafted language was an acknowledgement that property ownership had not been properly verified before construction began. That was probably the closest thing to accountability anyone was ever going to get. Leonard moved away less than a year later. I heard he sold his house and relocated to another state. Maybe the controversy played a role. Maybe it didn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that every now and then someone still asks me whether I would handle it differently if it happened again. The answer surprises people. No, I wouldn't. Not because I enjoyed the fight. Not because I wanted revenge. But because boundaries only matter when people respect them. The moment you allow someone to ignore them for convenience, they stop being boundaries at all. They become suggestions. And property rights were never meant to be suggestions. So that's my story. I left town for less than a week and came home to find a community project built on land nobody bothered to ask permission to use. In the end, the trail disappeared, the bills stopped, and the boundary line returned exactly where it had always been. But the debate never really ended. Some people still think I should have sold the land and moved on. Others think the HOA got exactly what it deserved. And honestly, I can understand why people land on both sides of that argument. So now I want to hear from you. If you came home and found a neighborhood association had built a public trail on your property without asking, what would you have done? Would you have accepted an offer to sell and avoid the conflict, or would you have fought to make them remove every single inch of it? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, community conflicts, and the moments when ordinary people stand their ground, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who has strong opinions about where the line between community good and private rights should be drawn. Because sometimes the most expensive thing a person can do is assume someone else's property belongs to everyone.